Hey, yeah, so thank you all for coming to our community call for December. This is actually sort of a repeat of our call in a way from last month, but we wanted to do it in a different time zone so that folks in different parts of the world can attend. And we'll try to do that in the future as well. It's often hard to find a time zone that works for everyone, so we'll try to move things around. Yeah, and so for those that are new to the Webrecorder community calls, just a brief intro about the Webrecorder project. Our goal is to build open source tools, specializing specifically in kind of a user-driven form of web archiving, where users can create archives directly using their browser, essentially sort of a curator-driven archiving. Yeah, some of our key goals that we'd like to share include obviously making quality open source web archiving tools, so making web archiving more accessible through decentralized technologies, and being able to integrate with existing archival systems, really to empower anyone to create, use, and share web archives however they want to, and also to standardize web archiving formats, and we'll talk about that during this call. And we also work on intersection of web archiving and software emulation occasionally as well. Yeah, and so during this call, we wanted to talk about a recent grant that we just received that is focused on design and research and standardization. And this is a grant from the Falkland Foundation that we received about a month ago. And a lot of the work in this grant is focused on there's basically three tracks in this grant. One is the standardization of the WACZ format, how it's used, and collecting use cases around that. Another track on this is UX research and design and threat modeling around browser-based web archives. And last part is implementation and integration of this research into our existing tools. Yeah, and so we're really excited about this grant. Part of the reason for this call is to sort of talk to all of you and kind of understand better essentially how what we're doing can help your web archiving needs, and also to understand some of the potential threats and use cases around web archiving in the browser. And so we'll get into that in more detail. And our team for this grant includes Ed Summers, who was helping out with technical writing and spec of the WACZ format. Includes Cade, Diehm, and the New Design Congress on research and UX. Includes Lorena Ramírez-López, who's our community manager and also the project manager for this grant. It includes our colleague Mauve, who will be helping out with the implementation, and myself as sort of the project lead. And yeah, to start out, so a brief introduction of New Design Congress, who some of you may not be familiar with, and yeah, maybe I'll pass it on to Cade to say a few words.
Hi, thanks, Ilya. So thank you for everybody for being here. There's probably a few people here from Australia. I am also Australian. I run a research organization in Berlin called the New Design Congress. And what we do is starting from a framing of understanding all forms of digital technology as a form of expressions of power. So the ideas of infrastructure and the idea of building or maintaining infrastructure as a form of power, or like political power or social power. We then look to some of the ways in which these things have gone wrong and also how they've gone well. And we try to build new perspectives that people can use to kind of look at the present and alternatively fork the present into potentially different outcomes based on either things that worked very well in the past or things that weren't tried in the past. So the idea is looking at different perspectives through either anti-colonialism or from different political positions that weren't explored in the context of digital technologies and infrastructure or other systems, to then critique existing structures of power and infrastructure. And so in the case of this grant and of the work with Web Archive, Webrecorder and web archiving in general, we see web archiving as an extremely important part of digital memory in the future. This is true both on a personal level as people creating archives for themselves, or in the case of Webrecorder, people producing web archives from their own machines rather than in an institutional perspective, but also the idea of digital memory and culture, cultural archiving from an institutional perspective. And in the last, say, in the last, say, 10, 15 years, I think we've seen a pretty huge change in how web archiving has manifested in the case of its strengths and weaknesses, or strengths and precarities, if you like. And so for our goals for this project are really to sort of, if you look at the history of digital archiving and web archiving, we really have this case in which the tools are very good or do particular things very well, but they haven't kept up with the pace of change, especially from a political perspective or a threat modeling perspective, with the world at large. And so our goals are really to develop a deeper understanding of the use cases, opportunities, and potential outcomes of web archiving, both good and bad. You know, web archiving itself has it starts with static websites, but has extended far beyond that to YouTube videos and all sorts of other applications. And so that's really important. But also the bad part of it, which is web archiving in the context of harassment or political operation, or as a tool for distributing malware, all sorts of things. But more beyond that too, we look at things from a very conceptual perspective. As I said, where we're looking at alternative forking, this idea of seeing what the potential future could be. And so what we're really looking at here is understanding the opportunities of archiving via the browser. And this is both in the case of archiving as an individual activity, but also from an institutional perspective of understanding the power of what's available to us, and also what WACZ as a format can offer, the potentials of new formats in the future. And what we're trying to do here is to express this research via both design, so making design recommendations for WACZ and for Webrecorder that's kind of channeled through maybe people on this call, through interviews or research and collaboration, or from our broader research projects that we do at New Design Congress. And that design manifests both in its conceptual thinking of what a design system might look like, but also the user interfaces, so how they actually look and feel, but also through threat modeling. So the idea of looking at digital security and things like that. And not to sort of focus this too much on myself, but just quickly, my background, I started my career by prototyping Signal, the secure messaging app that you probably have heard of, with Open Whisper Systems. And since then, I've worked in this sort of halfway point between interfaces, political systems, and digital securities for the last, say, 8 years or so. And so this is what I'm bringing, and my team brings to this work.
Great. Thanks so much, Cade, for this intro. Yeah, and so first of all, we'll kind of cover the, so here's our plan. So we're going to talk about first the WACZ format and kind of the use cases that we've been collecting. And then Cade will talk in more detail about the UX research and sort of the plan for that and how you can get involved. Yeah, so we'll start with the WACZ format, which I think we've talked about in previous calls, and sort of initially created it. I think, gosh, at this point, it's been about a year, I think. No, probably more since the initial version. And here's a link to the latest spec that Ed has helped kind of turn into a more formal specification layout. We're kind of working towards that. If you're kind of new to this, you might think, well, why create a new web archiving specification? The reasons for that are several. Some of you may be familiar with the work format, which is sort of the standard in web archives as an ISO format. But the work format mostly just includes the raw HTTP network traffic. What it doesn't include are some of these other things, such as a list of pages to start browsing from, any sort of full text search index, or technical metadata, or a descriptive metadata about the web archive. And so those are sort of key things that we know are important for web archives to have. And so it's just kind of starting from that, just having the raw network traffic is not really enough to make a usable web archive. So that's kind of how the WACZ format started, is we wanted to make a format that includes all of these things and is also makes it easy to load this format directly in the browser. So there's also a built-in index in the WACZ format. Kind of starting from that, we're also now considering additional things. So these first 4 entries here are already part of the spec. We're also considering if you want to add, for example, screenshots, potentially encryption for the WACZ format, as well as sort of proof of authenticity. That's something that has been coming up more and more. Also, crawler capture logs, perhaps part of the technical metadata, and some way to access multiple WACZ files at once. And essentially what the WACZ format does is it packages up. So the reason it's a box, basically as a zip file that we put work files as well as this other data in sort of a consistent way. And so if you have work files already, you can package them up into a WACZ file along with this other data in sort of a consistent way. The idea is to have a portable format that stores more than just their own network traffic. The details of this are in the specification, sort of how we're packaging this up, basically with a specific directory structure. And Ed Summers, who's on the call here, I don't know, Ed, if you want to talk about this, or I can kind of summarize it. Ed wrote a really excellent blog post about WACZ, and these are some of the use cases that I think he highlighted from that blog post.
Hey, Ilya.
Hi, Ed.
Hi. I don't really know what to add here other than that these were just some use cases that kind of came out from the GitHub repository. So, but yeah, these largely came from there, and I just sort of highlighted them in the blog post. Yeah, maybe we'll talk more about that as the call goes on.
Yeah, thank you for putting this together. We basically started collecting some of these use cases, which includes sort of extracting data from web archives and giving them to researchers. So that's one kind of set of use cases around that. Cryptographic signing of web archive data and packaging as WACZ is yet another use case. Integrating into existing repositories and being able to essentially host WACZ files along with other data in repositories is yet another use case. I think a really big one that can really lower the barrier to web archives. And we actually saw an excellent example of this just at the end of last week. Yeah, we can kind of dive into these use cases in more detail shortly. We're also following the frictionless data spec, which is sort of an existing specification for portable data, been created by the Open Knowledge Foundation. Yeah, the idea is to kind of extend this spec as the basis for WACZ so that we have something to build on. Yeah, so that's kind of how this format came about and sort of where some of the use cases that we're considering. So here's all of the use cases that we've collected in detail so far, which probably easier to look at this. There's actually quite a few of them. We also are, and this is from Cade's suggestion, we're also considering anti-use cases or threats, essentially sort of what are the things that we want to guard against and sort of prevent web archives from being used in a harmful way. And so we're trying to enumerate these as well and track them. So definitely feel free to look at these, and add new ones. And I think at this point we can see that if there are some questions already, we can take a pause here and talk about any questions.
We have a question regarding, is everything in a WACZ generated from the work file / content? And is there a tool for generating the WACZs?
Yes, that's a great question. The second question is easier to answer, and I guess Ed has already shared that. Yes, we have essentially a tool for creating WACZ files out of work files that will go through and create a WACZ file and index and in terms of is all the content generated from the work file directly? Could be, but not necessarily, especially when it comes to full text search. So for full text search, for example, what we do in the case of crawling with browser tricks and also with the archive web page extension is we actually grab the text from the rendered page and then store it in a format that's then packaged into the WACZ, which you can also generate full text extraction from the work itself, but it's we find that it's more accurate to generate it directly from the browser. So that's the main thing. There's other things like, obviously if it's user metadata and kind of just descriptive metadata it's something that's, in the case of PyWax, it can be passed in as a parameter, a combination of mostly coming from the work, but with additional data coming from either the browser or from the user. So hopefully that kind of, we definitely plan to kind of add some more documentation on that. Yeah, and so if there are any, would it be helpful to look at the issues that we have? I guess before moving on to the UX research, or maybe we could just move on to that. I guess I could open the issue tracker here. So here's so we've got actually quite a few of these already. And here are some sort of the threats, the anti-use cases to call them. And yeah, our plan is to kind of go through and maybe group these together potentially. But for right now, we're trying to sort of enumerate as many of these as possible for sort of how the WACZ format can be used, and also related to that, sort of how browser-based web archives could be used. Although this is here, we're trying to sort of track not even browser-created web archives, but also we're also including larger scale crawling as well in this, and kind of essentially trying to enumerate a few different use cases that, if you have additional suggestions or input on how WACZ format might be useful to you, please feel free to let us know, or feel free to create a new use case or edit an existing one. Yeah, so if there aren't any questions, or
I could talk a little bit about the background of the use cases, like the threats and stuff.
sure.
If you want.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So we talked a little bit about this. This came up earlier in the previous call because someone on the call just happened to ask the question that kind of sparked the discussion. So I'll bring this up now. So what we're doing collectively here is, alongside the use cases of like the idealized user, as Ilya and Ed have talked about, we're also looking at like the anti-use cases. Historically, in digital security, you would start to look at the threats of a system from the perspective of maybe the machine or like the network, like the connectivity between two computers or so forth. And basically what this is a method of the framework for understanding the threats that exist in a digital or online context. But instead of them being from looking at securing the computers between each other, so looking at like cryptography or network penetration, all these other tools that a hacker might use to exploit a system. Instead, the approach that socio-technical security does is it looks at the relationships between people when they're communicating online or otherwise interacting in a digital system. And so by focusing on those relationships between two or more people and securing that relationship, so making sure that the people who are speaking to each other are doing so safely, both for each other, but in a broader context, like the people around them, and looking at those relationships. What we're doing here is trying to build a threat modeling system and a way of understanding the threats of both web archiving, but also more broadly, like the idea of collecting information and sharing that in a curatorial sense, like for institutions or for individuals who are sharing with institutions. We're looking at it less from a perspective of like, how could you be monitored doing this, and more from a perspective of like, what are the relationship costs or the implications socially as a result of doing this kind of work, and looking at the human cost. And so this is reflected quite substantially in the threats use cases that you see in GitHub. And so the reason I'm saying this now, off the back of what Ilya has just said, is to invite everybody on this call to either make suggestions via email to us about threats that you might see in your day-to-day work, or to get involved in our research project and reach out to us for an interview so we can talk more specifically about the social or political or professional issues or nuances that you might have as a result of your work in this kind of activity. And, you know, if it sounds like, just to make this super clear, if you're concerned about like whether it's too non-technical or things like that, this is the absolute opposite. So technical security is about the opposite of like technical ability or things like that. This is very specifically about like the non-technical aspects of these kinds of practices of web archiving.
And we'll have all the links in the chat. Yeah, thanks so much for providing that background. Yeah, before we switch to talking more about the UX research, which I guess this was a nice transition. Let's see, I think we had one comment in the chat. If you'd like to unmute and say the comment as well, you could do that, or we could just read it. We're such a small group, so feel free to talk if you'd like.
Yeah, it was just really looking at the use cases and just saying, you know, there might be times when this was a particular example where somebody had lost a copy of their website and they were trying to reconstruct it, and were wanting us to, wondering if we were able to provide a copy of the WACZ files that we had in our web archive and provide it to them. So just commenting, really, that's just another use case. But for us to do that, we'd need to be able to, so it wasn't something that was done in Webrecorder with the WACZ file, and then you could download and then provide it to them later. It was a WACZ file, a number of WACZ files that we'd need to package up into a WACZ kind of format, I guess, to pass on, but then probably wouldn't have all the indexing necessarily, and we'd have to work out a way to do that.
Yeah, that's definitely, yeah, I think we might not actually have that as a use case currently, so that's definitely something that might make sense to add. Would it be for the purpose of for them to reconstruct the website and host it again, or for them to have their own copy of the website?
In this case, it was someone who wanted to reconstruct it again because using the base information and create a new website from that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, there's probably, they might want to, yeah, we can think about how we can do that to make it easier for people to do it, or at least to first sort of understand what is archived first from the WACZ file, and then maybe have a sort of an extract. Yeah, that's more of an extract operation where it would then, for example, extract the WACZ into the raw, for example, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in that case, probably. But yeah, that is a good use case to keep in mind, because I'm sure that will probably come up with other archives as well. Yeah, so yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And oh yes, yes, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so we did actually have, I see, yeah, the use case that was mentioned earlier, yeah, I think is actually, I think Nicholas opened this issue around recreating a lost website from a web archive. So we should probably elaborate on this a bit more, sort of how this can be used. So
Ilya, before you shift on to the UX research part, is there anything you can tell us about the development of the screenshots part of WACZ? That's a
good question. Well, it's still in development. I think right now it's only been prototyped in the browser crawler code base. We actually haven't written up how we would store that in the WACZ yet, but we should probably gather some more information on sort of what the best approaches are. I mean, I think part of it is sort of deciding sort of how many screenshots should be made and kind of like what resolution, and I think that there's some of that ongoing in the browser crawler issue. I think that there's actually a pull request around that, and then we're going to package that into WACZ, but we actually haven't yet gotten as far as writing out the spec on what that should look like. But if you have specific thoughts on that, we'd definitely love to hear that, and or sort of like what would make most sense to you. I was thinking it was probably an option to create screenshots for the pages. All the URLs that are key pages in the WACZ file could also have screenshots that are probably stored in work as well, but we haven't gotten as far as actually speccing it out yet.
We've been developing a similar feature for WCT. Unfortunately, they're relying on kind of third-party tools and stuff to implement it, but we've kind of gone through similar requirements of what sort of screenshots, what do we want screenshots of, what sizes, but also the archived version as well as the live version, the live version as well as the archived version for QA. But yeah, I'd be interested to see how you're implementing that in Browsertrix. I assume it's all within Browsertrix. It's not relying on anything external.
Right. Yes. It would be in that case. It would be essentially getting the screenshot from the browser using the I believe the Chrome API directly to get a screenshot of the page. And of course, that there's 1,000 different ways to do that. What resolution? If it's sort of the full page or just the viewport that's visible. So yeah, so there's sort of many options, and yeah, I think the hard part is deciding how to do it. So actually taking the screenshot is the easiest part. The hard part is deciding what the spec should be and deciding on what the best screenshot makes sense, or maybe there's more than one. So that could be definitely a discussion, and probably should try to handle that through GitHub perhaps, so that we can keep a track of any decisions and conversations around that. Cade, is there more that you'd want to say around that?
I mean, I kind of jumped a bit to it earlier in this call, but yeah, I think this is really the central question of both UX research and also the threat modeling research, which is kind of intertwined.
Right.
This has a lot of different implications, and it's a really large question, but it's a really open question at the same time, and it's tied in a lot with like the implementation or the spec building that your team as developers are working on.
So one thing to definitely keep in mind is that this is kind of all intertwined, and that's sort of partly why we're kind of doing these things together, is that sort of we're both trying to develop the actual spec for the format, but also understand all of the implications of actually creating web archives and kind of how one will influence the other. So for example, screenshots could be yet another example of that. Actually haven't talked about as much, but can have, different use cases can have different requirements for screenshots, and figuring out how they're stored in the spec might be influenced by what exactly is needed for screenshots. Actually taking the screenshot is simple, but doing it in a way that's useful is the part that and maybe standardized and reusable is the part that needs some more thinking and figuring out. And one other thing that we could show is, and this is actually, so we just learned about this on Friday. This is a really excellent use case for WACZ format that was created for cinephiles, which is part of the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. So Michael, who's been working on creating this web archive, shared this, I think, just on Friday. And so this is a digital repository that stores web archives as part of as essentially integrated into the repository along with other data that they have. And so you can see document type web archive here. And when we click on one of these, they sort of, the web archive is loaded as a WACZ file. So this internally is loading from a WACZ file, and it's using our replay web page viewer to essentially render the web archive directly in the page. And so you can see sort of the list of pages here. And so all of this is coming from the WACZ, and it loads pretty fast because I actually had it cached ready, but even if I clear the cache, it will still load fairly quickly because the WACZ format allows for on-demand loading. So for example, there might be 56 pages here, but it's only loading the first one when we load the initial page, and then each of these new pages will be loaded on demand. So it's fairly, I think a really excellent use of a WACZ format and some of the possibilities that exist with integrating web archives into existing institutional repositories. And yeah, we hope to see more such use cases. So we're just really all excited to see this.
Ilya, is the WACZ file being delivered service from the server, or is it actually within the browser?
So if we look at it's basically served from, I believe in this case, AWS. So if we look at the source here, you can see that sort of in order to render the web archive, all that's needed is sort of, we have a special HTML tag here. I don't know how well you've seen. So it's loading the WACZ file from an S3 bucket, and then all of the rendering is happening in the browser.
Right, but it's loading, when you talk about it's only loading one page at a time. When you click on that next page, it's going to load it from AWS, or it's preloaded the WACZ into the browser. It's
loading parts of the WACZ, yeah. So it's loading, it's using range requests to load parts of the WACZ. So if you have a large, for example, you could have a web archive or a WACZ file that is many gigabytes in size, and but it will fairly quickly because it's loading only the part that's needed for each page. So that's another part which I didn't mention initially, and that was also a key goal for creating this format is, and here's another example that I'd like to share is this URL. So this uses a WACZ file that's about 17 gigabytes, and it only loads the small portion of it that's needed for the initial page. And then as you start browsing, it'll load other parts from the same file using range requests. Yeah, so if there are...
Ilya, this is Ed. One thing that came up on the last call that we did on the same topic was, I think we spent some time talking about, and you already mentioned it too, authenticity of the web archives. And I think that, I remember, I think Cade also talking about this a bit as well. You know, the traditional model of web archives where you have kind of an institution, like the Internet Archive or the British Library, running a web archiving like Wayback Machine or what have you, and also the crawling infrastructure to collect the data, the web archives. The thing that is changing quite a bit with this introduction of a way of packaging up web archive data such that it can live, on a website somewhere else, somebody's blog perhaps, that it changes the dynamics quite a bit, right? Because suddenly, you can be presented, be looking at what appears to be a web archive right on a website that you can interact with it as if it was a web archive. But yeah, like there's all sorts of threats associated with potentially modifying the web archive and publishing, right? And sort of like using web archives, as part of disinformation campaigns or something like that. But But yeah, so, we mentioned it earlier that we're interested in these sort of anti-use cases, but I think there's all sorts of things that possibilities that, we need your help in sort of identifying what some of these possibilities might be, right? When you think about web archives no longer being centralized so much and much more distributed. So I just thought I'd just underline that because I thought it was an interesting thing that came up in the last conversation.
Yeah, and that's in a way sort of why these challenges exist and why we're trying to figure out sort of how to approach this and kind of just to do a quick demo of kind of what Lorena was also saying with so for example, I create, this is kind of obviously a very quick demo. Let's say I, for example, archive using our extension, you can create an archive of the Webrecorder Twitter page logged in, and here I'm logged in as Webrecorder. I can I can start autopilot, and I don't quite have time to talk about that, but basically it'll automate scrolling through the feed. So I'll just stop that now. But and then I can then download this as a WACZ file, and then I can put this online and share it with anyone. But then the question is how do we trust this? How do we know that that this particular web archive that is shared is actually what the Webrecorder Twitter page said, and not someone going in and changing the data? And that's sort of the part that we'll be trying to figure out is how to make this something that is more trustworthy. And then also with issues such as what does it mean to archive when you're logged in as a user on social media, and then kind of the implications of that and the risks and threats associated with that. Trying to approach web archives from all of these perspectives, which are sort of outside the kind of traditional approaches, I think. And yes, for example, if I were to upload this demo, that WACZ file that I just downloaded somewhere, so obviously you're seeing in this call, and you see that I make this file, but then how does someone else trust that this is the file that was created by me, and that someone else that created a fake archive of Webrecorder Twitter? And I think this is a really important thing to be able to figure out if web archives are to become more widely used and more kind of created by people individually and so forth. And so yeah, that's this is kind of a large part of what we're trying to do. And yeah, I guess we have a couple more minutes, so I can open it up to more questions. Or
just a question about sharing those files, Ilya. So you mentioned before there was a 17 gigabyte WACZ file, and I've heard you talk about there's no real limit to what those file sizes could be, but I feel like there's probably a practical limit in sharing files. How have you guys thought about how you could you have multiple WACZ files that make up one web archive for the sake of making those files easier for people to download and consume and transfer around?
Yes, yeah. So that's also part of the spec. That's a great question. That part hasn't yet been fully defined, but one idea that we've been talking about is essentially one WACZ per web archive. Obviously, we'll run into some size limitations eventually. So, for example, one approach might be one WACZ file per crawl, or even smaller, or perhaps multiple WACZ files per crawl. But then having a way to specify multiple WACZ files as making up a collection, and having essentially kind of a manifest of WACZ files that each one is kind of self-contained, but if viewed together, make up a web archive collection. Especially for smaller crawling, you could have each crawl add a new WACZ file. Yeah, and essentially add things that way.
Great. Well, it sounds like you're thinking about the problem.
Yeah. So and we'll definitely share more work on that when we start trying to specify that. Yeah.
Ed, I want to thank you for linking the issues that are related to what's been brought up. I think it's also very important that if you see an issue, you can comment on it as well, saying, I also have a similar problem, because then that issue becomes more of a priority.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Lorena. I meant to add a note about that, because definitely, like, yeah, we're hoping that, you know, that these will be kind of conversations, right? And as much as GitHub supports conversations, that we can talk about the issues that are there. And also, if you feel like the issue that's there doesn't quite address like what you're interested in, by all means, just create another one. We can always, you know, group things together later. More is definitely better.
Yep, absolutely. And looks like we're just about out of time. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Yeah, hope you all have a great holiday.